We're talking about, in the formal model I'm going to discuss first, supply in a perfectly competitive industry. An industry where firms produce a standardized product, lots of different firms sell it, it's a commodity in effect, and the firm really has no decision to make about what to charge for the product. That's just determined by the intersection of supply and demand curves in the market. The supply curve in the market is upward sloping. We saw in the summary discussion of this, that's for two reasons. The fruit pickers rule and the fact that different suppliers, actual and potential, face different marginal costs of their time and effort to enter this market as a participating supplier. I was trying to use an example that wouldn't seem so hackneyed to people. I wanted to use a question.
Sorry, would you mind turning down the volume?
Oh, sorry. Does that help?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, that hum, that buzz or whatever it is comes to you. It doesn't come as harshly to me. So yeah, feel free to remind me to do that if I don't remember. I wanted to use another musical example, but I didn't want to use Clapton and Dylan yet again. You know, I could anticipate the groans, so I asked my youngest son, give me a musician I can use for one of these examples I do in my class. They're so tired of Clapton and Dylan. I want to give them something fresher than that. And so he said, give him 50 Cent. Who? 50 Cent? Yeah, 50 Cent. He's a rapper. He's pretty popular amongst the young kids. So I said, all right, I'll use 50 Cent. So the question is, at what price would Fitty be willing? At what price would Fitty be willing to offer his services for sale in the market for call responders in a call center? If they paid him 50 cents a call, would he do it? No. No way they would do it. He said, be sure and call him Fitty. That'll blow their minds. Yeah. And it did blow their minds. How does this geezer know he's Fitty? They're all asking themselves. So you gotta stretch your imagination a little bit. There's some planet, some distant planet. They're rich beyond our imagination. Nobody wants to do call center staffing there. And so they've decided to outsource that task to the Earth. And they've got huge volumes of calls to deal with, so they've got almost everybody working for them, and the price they've offered is up to $1 million a call. Calls take 30, 40 seconds to resolve, sometimes as long as a minute. Would you work in a call center for $1 million a call? Would Fitty? Maybe not. He said, no, I don't want to do that. I'm a proud musician. I want to stay on. But then he would discover that everyone else was working for $1 million a call, earning vastly greater incomes than he was earning on the tour, and he couldn't afford an apartment with a view of Central Park anymore. So at some point, the price gets high enough where even he says, all right, yeah, I guess I'll take calls, at least for part of the day. That's opportunity cost. It's about the fact that the supply curve is based on people who are in the industry, yes, but not just them. It's based on people who might be in the industry. And at higher prices, people who are doing something else would be tempted, ultimately, to make a switch. We're going to assume that firms are profit maximizing. Is that the only motive of firms? No. Many of you here hope to work for a socially conscious firm, a firm that lets you say when you go home at night, I didn't make millions of other people's lives miserable today. So firms that can offer an opportunity to serve in an activity like that can attract better employees at any given wage than ones that you have to leave saying, oh man, I wish I hadn't caused as much misery as I did today. And so, no, it's not the only motive. But if you don't think profit is an important concern of firms, probably this isn't the right program for you either. It's an important yardstick. If your firm is in the private for-profit sector and doesn't earn profits, then it's not for long. So as a first approximation, economists say, well, we assume that firms are profit maximizing. Sure, there are examples of ones that don't do a very good job of that. Often they get taken over or bought out by somebody, and then those people profit maximize. So the definition of profit is very simple. It's the difference between what you take in and all the costs that you incur, explicit and implicit. You'll discover in due course that economists think about profit in a different way from the way accountants think about it. We don't think, when I say we economists don't think the way accountants think about it is the right way to think about it. But you better know how to think about it that way too, because the numbers that come out quarterly from the earnings reports of public companies are accounting profits, the way the accountants think about them. And you got to know what those are too, but we're going to be talking about a different kind of profits, and it's the difference between what you take in and not just what you pay out. That difference is accounting profit, but what you pay out also minus all the things you could have done with the resources that you owned or supplied yourself to the firm. So it's really a much more inclusive measure of costs that economists take into account. What's a profit maximizing firm? It's just one whose goal is to maximize that difference. A perfectly competitive market, what's that? It's one in which no individual firm has any control over the price for which it sells its product. That's the definition of a perfectly competitive firm. There are lots of lists of conditions that are correlated with when this condition will be met, but this is the defining condition. The wheat market is pretty close. It's a commodity. There are different types of wheat, but nobody argues about what the price of wheat is. That's determined in the market. Alex?
If we define the price as the result of supply and demand, is it really true that individual supplier has no impact on the price then? Because he can impact the supply basically, right? He can make a production decision and either produce a lot or just a little amount.
Yes, that's why in the perfectly competitive case, stereotypically, there are lots and lots of producers, each one of which produces a small fraction of the industry's output. That would be true of wheat farmers. There are literally tens of thousands of them. One farmer's supply decision is of no consequence to the market price. You won't be able to measure it. Photocopying, that's a commodity market. Maybe it once wasn't, but it certainly is now. There's just sort of a standard price per copy. Nobody argues about it and haggles. It's a number. A price taker is what we mean by a participant in a competitive market. It has no influence over the price at which it sells its product. It's just a given. It's a datum. Coin laundries are price takers. You don't argue about what the price is. They don't go through endless debate about what to charge. There's a going rate for coin laundries. Car wash services, that's a competitive market, roughly speaking, too. It's a standardized commodity. If you go on posters.com, you'll see a bunch of different reproductions of artworks. You'll price them, then you'll go on art.com. You'll see the same posters priced at the same level on each website, and there are a couple of others that sell these too. They're a commodity. These are price takers. The original canvas, no. There's only one of them. They're not a price taker. That's a matter of what the seller thinks he can get and how quickly he thinks he can sell the canvas. Does he want to move it quickly? Does he want to hold out for the highest possible price? That's a price setter, not a price taker. Microsoft, in its heyday, was a price setter. It could vary the price of its operating system, and the sales would go up and down, but they wouldn't go to zero if it raised its price. They wouldn't go to infinity if they lowered the price. It would be a choice they would have to make. Intel was part of that same price setter combine. Branded products are price setters. Coke can raise its price and sell a few less units. It can lower its price and expand its sales. It's not a price taker. It has to figure out what to charge. Diet Coke, it's the same thing. It's a branded product. Contrast that with Wegmans Diet Cola. That's a commodity. The price is more or less given by supply and demand in that part of the market. A generic smartphone, that's a commodity. They're not agonizing over what to charge. They're charging what they can. They're not saying, if we raise our price, here's what will happen. They're saying, if we raise our price, we won't sell anything. Because there's lots of options. They're all crummy. People can buy something else if we charge more. We won't lower our price because we can already sell what we want to sell at that price. Contrast that with the premium end of the smartphone market. September 12th, that's the rumored date for the new iPhone announcement. Everybody's all excited. There's going to be, what to call it, the iPhone 8, the iPhone Pro, the iPhone 10th anniversary commemorative edition. What are we going to call this thing? Well, Apple hasn't told us yet. That builds suspense. And what's it going to cost? Nobody really knows. Daisuke W., I'm not going to even try to pronounce his last name, in a New York Times article last week, announced that from conversations he had with people in the know, the new iPhone superphone is going to be priced at $999. Others have said, well, maybe the introductory model will be priced at that, the one with only 56 gigabytes, but the 128 gigabyte model will be priced at $11.99, and the 512 gigabyte model at $14.99 or what. Nobody knows, but Apple has the ability to choose those price levels, and it will see demand or the quantity demanded vary accordingly. It's a price setter. We're not talking about that kind of company now. We will talk about that kind of company in due course. So now the production decision is all that matters for companies that can't set their price. They are price takers. They don't need to worry about the price. They just look it up and see what it is on the internet in the morning. And then they make a decision. What do they have to decide what to do? How much should we make? How many units should we produce? And that's the decision that I'm going to focus on. So a factor of production. I see 2 or 3 here. One is the guy who works on the project. That's a factor of production. One is the tool he uses. That's the saw that he's holding in his hand. There's other stuff. You could probably see a hammer in his belt if you look closely. Those are factors of production. There are things used in the process of making things. A fixed factor is one that you can't change the amount of in the short run. An example, a transmission tower for an FM station. It takes you a while to get the permits. Building it takes time. Getting a plot where you could put it without running into zoning problems, that's an issue too. So if you wanted to change the number of stations you had, or open a new station, or make a bigger one with a different kind of tower, it would take you some time to do that, and you can't do that in the short run. What's the short run? It's the length of time during which you can't alter a fixed factor of production. What's a fixed factor of production? It's the factor you can't alter in the short run. It's a circular definition, clearly, and I own that. There's nothing I can do about that. Just think that it's a roughly useful set of terms to use. Some inputs take a long time to alter, others are more freely variable, and it makes sense to distinguish among them for certain types of decisions that the firm has to make. So variable factor of production, just as I said, as an example, if you're talking about radio stations, the music library is a variable factor of production, relatively speaking. You can increase or reduce your CD library in short time. If you're talking about electronic copies of music, you can do it almost instantaneously. We're going to talk about one specific example, the Louisville Slugger Company. There actually is a company called that. What do they make? Baseball bats. I would expect a higher proportion of the men in the class to know the answer to that question than of the women, although even women will, many enough of you have played softball there aren't any women in the major leagues, but they're kind of invading baseball more and more. There will someday be a major league woman baseball player, even if there isn't one very high up in the minors today. That will come. Louisville makes baseball bats, the implement with which baseball players attempt to hit the ball. They use labor to make these bats, and they also use capital. So think about a lathe, the building that houses the lathe, all that stuff is their capital. And I'm thinking of the labor as the variable input, something they can change the quantity of on short notice. The capital takes longer. You could find examples where it would be the reverse. The capital is easily altered, the labor not so much. These inputs work on an intermediate good, wood in this case, and they transform the intermediate good. They add value to it in the process of making it into a more finished product. The production is actually the value added, technically speaking. So I'm just going to be talking about the process of adding value to the log here. We have a short-run production function. It looks remarkably like the utility function we looked at in the demand segment. The more employees per day you have, the more bats you get. And notice too the pattern that resembles the pattern we saw there. Beyond a certain point, that is to say, beyond the second worker, add a third worker, you get only 30. You were getting 60 by adding the second worker, then 20, then 15, then 10, then 6. That's the law of diminishing returns. The diminishing returns in production is an almost universal feature of production. It doesn't occur right away necessarily, but eventually it occurs in almost every production function. It occurs because of the fact that some inputs are fixed, and if we add more and more variable inputs to them, we run into bottlenecks. Think about a typing pool. Julian has decided to run for office. He needs to raise money, so he's hired typists to send letters to potential donors. We're going to make the country great again, he says. But we can't do that without your contribution. And so we type out letters as if we were writing to old friends. We've got 4 typewriters in the office. We've got 1 typist. So we got a certain number of letters per day in the process of producing. What would you think would happen to output if we hired a second typist? It would go up, but you can do better than that. It would double, unless the typists were different in ability, and why complicate it? We'll assume they're all the same. Output doubles. You hire a third typist, what happens? It goes up by 50%. Hire a fourth typist, goes up by a third. What happens when you hire a fifth typist? Nothing. No? Well, wait a minute. Think about that. What happens to your output if you hire a fifth typist? Let's make this more realistic, the way the old people who come to CAU are wont to do. Well, so you got 4 typists. They take bathroom breaks. They go eat lunch. They they're not at their machines the whole shift. They take breaks, so you got a reserve typist. You send her in or him in to type when the others are on break. You get a little more output that way. So you got diminishing returns setting in at that point. Hire a sixth typist, even less. The break taker takes breaks, maybe you could say. All right. It's bottlenecks. That's why we don't raise all the food for the 8 billion people on the planet by trying to do it all in one flower pot. There's no limit to the amount of seeds you could buy to put in it. You could put plenty of water in it, fertilizer. We got all we need of that, but you don't have enough land to make the output you need. It's a diminishing returns. You need a fixed factor to get diminishing returns. When you double all the factors, there's no presumption that you'll get less than double the amount of output that you had before in any time. Triple it, quadruple it. In general, this is my personal belief, and not every economist shares it, when you increase your scale, it's hard to imagine circumstances where you would do worse than a proportional increase in output. If you did worse, you call it, well, go back and just copy what you were doing in the first instance, you'll get a proportional increase. But there's almost always something you can consolidate and make more efficient if you have more time to increase all the inputs you use. And so in general, we would not expect to see any declining relationship between input and output if you were free to raise all the inputs in the same. It's about bottlenecks. The law of diminishing returns is specifically about bottlenecks. Okay, they diminish from the third employee on in this example. That's just a contingent fact of this example. It doesn't happen with employee 3 in every instance, obviously. That's what we're talking about when we use that language. Christian.
So back on that table, the first employee has 40 bats that he produces, then you add the second one at 60. So it doesn't have to be necessarily if the first one gives the most.
That's right. It doesn't have to be. No, there's room for all sorts of variations, but the law of diminishing returns says only beyond some point the extra output you get will diminish. Okay, important cost concepts. I think cost concepts are intrinsically boring. It's not as big a problem to talk to business school students about them as it is to talk to students in the arts college, because you came here knowing you were going to have to do accounting if you hadn't already done it before in the exam. So it must be that you have more tolerance than most people for cost concepts and discussions of them. Still, they're probably not the thing you most want to think about and talk about. And so you can think of the discussion of them as investment rather than consumption. It will pay dividends to know about these cost concepts. They're important. If you ignore them, that will be costly to you. That's another cost concept. They don't have to be interesting to be worth knowing about. But they're not that uninteresting when you get right down to it. They're not as boring as most people seem to think they are. So we're going to talk about these concepts within the framework of the concrete example we're working through, which is the Louisville Sluggers production activity. It's got some fixed inputs and some variable inputs. The lathe is a fixed input, the lathe in the factory, whatever so that's $80 per day. I'm telling you, where'd that number come from? I just gave it to you. That's a fixed cost. By definition, it's a payment to a fixed factor of production. That's what a fixed cost means. That's the definition of one. We abbreviate it FC. How did I come up with that? F for fixed, C for cost. This is not rocket science. RK, where those terms come from. R is the interest rate. K is the value of the capital equipment. So if the capital equipment was $1 million and the interest rate were 10%, our fixed cost would be $100,000 a year, just to illustrate. the payment to the employees, which were by definition a variable factor of production, that's a variable cost by definition. We denote that VC. You can figure out why we denote it as that. It's WL. What's the W and what's the L? The W is the wage rate that the laborer gets, and L is the amount of laborers we hire. And the total cost is just the sum of those two. We abbreviate it FC plus VC. We abbreviate it RK plus WL. There's all sorts of different ways to denote it. I'm going to assume that if you see those symbols, you will know what they mean. If you raise your hand on the midterms and say, what's WL? Sorry, can't help you. The question, do the best you can. Circle the best response you can identify among those 5. What's the firm's marginal cost? This is what I've been struggling with since day 1. I want you to know what marginal cost means. Marginal cost is a concept that is easy difficult. It sounds easy, and in some applications it's transparently simple, but knowing what it means and being able to apply the idea in certain other contexts is anything but simple. And most people get it wrong if they're not schooled in the nuances of marginal cost, and I don't want that to happen to you. I want you all to get out of this course knowing what marginal cost is and being able to speak intelligently about it. It's the change in total cost that occurs when there's a small change in output. It's that ratio. It's a local concept. How much does my total cost change when I increase my output by 0.1%? If you increase it by 20 or 30 or 40%, then maybe the marginal cost will be changing over that whole range, and you won't have a unique answer to the question. That's the same, notice, as the change in variable cost divided by the change in output. Why is that? Because total cost is fixed cost plus variable cost. What's the change in total cost when I change the level of output? It's the change in fixed cost plus the change in variable cost. What's the change in fixed cost? 0. So those two things are exactly the same. They're not approximately the same. They're exactly to the millionth of a penny. They're the same number. By definition. You want to argue about what's the short run, what's a fixed factor, we can have arguments, but you can't argue about whether those two things mean something different given the definitions. And the only decision that the competitive firm has to make is how much should I produce? That's the only decision we're going to focus on for it. And what that means is what's the level of output among all the ones I could produce that will result in the highest possible profit. That's the way we're going to approach that. It's a cost-benefit question you'll recognize immediately if you think about it. I'm not producing any output now. Should I even produce any? Well, if I produce any, what will be the benefit of doing that? What will be the cost of doing that? Should I produce any? Well, if the benefit will be greater than the cost, I should do it. Otherwise, I shouldn't do it. That's the underlying strategy of thinking about the production decision, the same as it is the underlying strategy for thinking about every decision that you think about in this context. And if you think about it, the profit maximizing condition is this. If that condition isn't satisfied, the firm can't be maximizing its profits. How do I know that? What's the benefit of expanding my output by 1 unit? I'll sell it. What will I get for it?
The price.
P. The price. What's the cost of expanding by 1 unit? MC. If that number is greater than MC, how can I be maximizing my profits? I would get more benefit by expanding than it would cost me to expand. If this number here is greater than the price. How can I be maximizing my profit? The cost of the last unit I made was greater than the benefit I got from it. That's a necessary condition for profit maximization. We'll see some special cases where this condition is met, but the firm ought to shut down. It's not a sufficient condition for profit maximization, but that's a nuance. The main thing I want you to take away is this comparison, because that's the one that drives the active decision of the firm. So for the record, here's the shutdown condition. Suppose the market price of your product falls so low that you can't cover the variable costs of production at any level of output. You've tried small levels, medium levels, large levels. At no level of output does your firm's price cover at any level the variable cost of production. Then you should shut your firm down, at least in the short run. You're going to earn a loss if you shut down. What's your loss going to be? Exactly equal to your fixed costs. Why? If you shut down, you get no revenue. What's your profit? It's your total revenue minus your total cost. So you have 0 as your total revenue minus your total cost. So it's 0 minus your fixed cost minus your variable cost. What's your profit? Minus fixed costs. Why? Because variable costs are 0 if you shut down. Okay. That's not a good outcome, but it's better than the outcome you would suffer if you produced and didn't cover your variable cost. You'd have an even bigger loss in that case. They say we're losing money on each unit, but we're hoping to make it up on the volume. No, that's an old vaudeville joke. You can't make it up on the volume if you're losing on each unit. If you're not covering the variable costs on each unit, then you're going to lose more money by producing than you would by not producing. P, the market price of the product. Q, the number of units you produce and sell. P times Q, that's your revenue. These are all familiar concepts. We've talked about them. The shutdown rule we can express very simply. If P times Q is always less than variable costs, no matter what level of Q we look at, shut down. That's the shutdown rule. It's logical. It makes sense if you think about it. You don't come back and say, can I meet with you in office hours to argue about the shutdown rule? It's uncontroversial. Why would you want to stay open if you can't cover your costs and you're going to lose more money by staying open? We can express that condition in a variety of ways, and let's define P times Q. That's total revenue. This is the way I just stated the shutdown condition. So if there's no Q for which P times Q exceeds variable cost, so if that inequality is less than for all levels of Q, shut down. An equivalent relationship, if you look at this inequality, Q is a positive number. I can divide both sides of the inequality by Q, and I get P less than variable cost divided by Q. And the inequality is in the same order, since you can divide an inequality by a positive number that preserves the inequality. This is the shutdown condition too. They're exactly equivalent. Those two inequalities convey the exact same information. And V over Q, it turns out, is a cost concept that we have a name for. It's called average variable cost. It's the variable cost averaged out over all the units you made. So it's not mysterious nomenclature. It's, if you had to invent a name for VC over Q, what would be the name you would invent for it? It would be average variable cost. And nobody would say, why'd you call it that? They'd know exactly why you called it that. What else would you call it? Gamma variable cost? I mean, I can't think of anything else that would make sense to call it. So here's the shutdown condition. If your price isn't as high as the minimum value of your average variable cost, get out of that market for the time being. If it's never going to get better, get out of that market permanently. But for the time being, you know, it doesn't pay you to operate. P less than the minimum value of average. Now this particular way of stating the shutdown condition is extremely helpful, it turns out, because we're going to think about these cost conditions graphically in short order. And when we look at them graphically, this is a very, very simple condition to verify whether it's met or not. Okay, average total cost over quantity. Profit equals total revenue minus total cost. That's just this. It's average total, it's price times quantity, that's total revenue. Average total cost times quantity, that's total cost. The difference, that's profit. Factor out the Q from that expression and you get P minus ATC times Q. This is profit per unit on the average. So your average profit per unit times the number of units you sell, that's your total profit. And you don't say, that can't be right. When you hear that, that's, of course, it's just a logical consequence of the definitions of those terms. If you think about it that way, then you'll see that a firm won't be profitable unless there's some price that's bigger than the minimum value of its average total cost. There's no way we can make money. That doesn't mean we shouldn't stay open in the short run. We should stay open in the short run if our price is above the minimum value of our average variable costs. But if it's not going to get above the minimum value of average total cost, then we ought to shut down in the long run. That's the long run shutdown condition. Go out of business. Yes?
What should we do if the price lies between the average total cost and the average variable cost?
If it's between the two, you should stay open in the short run. Because if it's between the two, then it's above the minimum value of the average variable cost, so it pays to stay open in the short run, even though you're going to lose money.
So I'm still going to keep losing money?
Until either conditions change, or if you decide they're not going to change, then you'll go out of business in the long run as soon as you can, if you don't think conditions are going to get any better. Okay. Here's a table. I think that looks like an incredibly boring table. But it's not a boring table when you think about what's in it. It's a lot of numbers, but the numbers stand in relationship to one another in very systematic ways, and I could take out 90% of the numbers in that table. That's an approximation. I didn't actually do the fraction. But I'll describe to you what I could eliminate, and you could fill in every missing number that I took out. But you couldn't do that if you didn't know how the concepts relate to one another. So think about the first two columns. If I took out any numbers from those columns, could you figure out what they had to be and fill them in? You need every one of those numbers. Those are givens. That's the production relationship. There's no way to tell a priori that when you go from 4 employees to 5, if I didn't give you that number, you couldn't say, well, it must be 165. You wouldn't know what it is. So those two are the data that you need to construct other numbers in the table. And there's more information besides them that you need, but not much more. The variable cost is 0 when you don't produce any output. Why is that? Because you don't hire any labor, and variable cost is W times L. What if you have 1 unit of labor? What's your variable cost? It's $24 a day. What do you learn from that?
The wage rate is $24.
The wage rate must be $24 a person per day. Why? Because you had 1 person and the variable cost was $24 a day. And if you want to check that, you can look at the variable cost moving down this column. It ought to go up by 24 every time you add somebody. Does it? Yeah. So praise be, I didn't make a mistake generating the table. That's how I generated the table all by myself. You know, I don't have an MBA. I could do that just by adding 24 to each column. Average cost. What's that? Average cost, average variable cost, what's that? That's variable cost divided by the number of bats per day. Well, I've got variable cost, I've got bats per day. Notice what the units are. That's 60 cents per bat. That's the average variable cost when I've hired one worker, because I've got 40 bats per day, $24 per day. My average variable cost is $24 per day divided by 40 bats per day. What do I get? Dollars per bat. Where'd the days go? They canceled out. The units are dollars per unit of output. How could I could erase, so you didn't need that 0.60, that was not necessary. You could compute it on your own, and every one of these other numbers you could compute on your own. Anybody could do that. A monkey could do that. Total cost is 80 when the output level is 0. Suppose I hadn't told you earlier what fixed cost was. What would you conclude from that? Fixed cost must be 80. Why? Because I'm not producing any output, and that's what it's costing me. That's the definition of fixed costs. It's the amount you pay to fixed factors of production. There aren't any variable factors of production being paid, so that must all be fixed costs. What happens to total cost as you move up? So you started with 80, you look at variable costs, and you add 80 to that. Your variable costs with one worker were 24. What's your total cost? 24 plus 80. All these numbers you immediately get. Just add 80 to the numbers in the variable cost column. Average total cost. Just divide total cost by the number of bats per day that you're producing, and that's that number. Marginal cost is the one you have to be careful. It's not a quantity that corresponds to any row in the table. It's in between the rows, but we've already seen why that's so. And so if you go from, let's say, 1 employee to 2, you get 60 extra bats. How much extra does it cost you? It costs you 24 extra to produce those 60 bats. What's the marginal cost? It's again going to be dollars per bat. So, and that turns out to be 40 cents per bat. You could fill in all the numbers in all those columns just on the basis of a little bit of information from the first part of the table. I might ask you to do a table like that on a midterm. And if you see a question like that, your first reaction ought to be, thank goodness, there's some free points. The other side of that coin is that if you miss it, think how you feel. Idiot! Those were free points and I didn't get them. So just practice a little bit. You know, the concepts are very easy to master. You'll be able to do this without any effort at all. You wouldn't have been admitted to the program if this was going to be challenging to you. But there is material that's challenging to you even if you were not a marginal admit. And I'm flagging that material and trying to hammer you over the head with it again and again and again, so it'll be, in the end, part of your working knowledge. Okay, I've taken the numbers in that table and I've graphed them. Look at the patterns here. Here's marginal cost. The rising portion of marginal cost, that's the portion that corresponds to the law of diminishing returns in the production process that we've seen here. That's when you need extra units, more and more units of the variable input to produce increments in output. Another property, the marginal cost curve hits the average variable and average total cost curves, both of them, at their minimum points. That's a very important relationship. Why does it do that? I'm going to give you a simple example illustrating the point here. Suppose we tried to estimate the weight of the students in this class. just off the top of our heads. What would we think in terms of probably? Well, it's mostly guys in the class, maybe a third women. Guys weigh about 180 on the average. Women maybe 120, 130 on the average. So some number between 120 and 180, closer to 180. I'm going to guess 160 is the average weight of people in the class. That's probably wrong, but if it's wrong, it's not wrong by 100 pounds. It's in the ballpark. Okay, now here's a question that I know everybody is going to be able to answer. We've got a new student just arrived today. He used to be the third string forward on the New York Knicks. He's 6'11", he weighs 402 pounds. He joins the class. What happened to the average weight of the class? Multiple choice. It went up, it went down, stayed the same, can't tell from the information given. It went up. Does anybody doubt that? Everybody knows about that. So we admitted a refugee from a famine area, 90-pound guy. What happened to the average weight in the class? It went down. All right, everybody knows that. So then you know everything you need to know why the marginal cost curve cuts these two curves at their minimum points. Marginal cost is less than average variable cost. That means if we produce another unit, the average must be falling. Marginal cost greater than average variable cost. That means if we produce an extra unit, we're pulling up the average. So the average is sloped that way. To the right of the intersection point, it slopes up. To the left of the intersection point, it slopes up. What does that mean? It's got to hit it at the minimum point. There's no other way for that to happen. And it's the exact same argument for the average total cost curve. Exactly the same argument. It's a lot easier to work with these curves if they're not the crude ones that I am forced to construct from a numerical example with discrete inputs in a table, but I'll just draw them as if it was a continuously variable input and so on. The firm faces a market price that has absolutely no control over. It can sell bats for 80 cents a piece in this made-up example. And the only question is, how many bats should it sell? Should it shut down? Should this firm shut down? What's the shutdown condition? If there's no variable output level for which price is greater than average variable cost, it should shut down. Well, it's clear that price is greater than average variable cost for every output level to the left of that one. So the shutdown condition, we don't need to worry about that. What should it produce? There's a uniquely correct answer. In this case, it should produce at the point circled, where price equals marginal cost. If it were to the right of that point, the cost of the last unit you would have produced would be higher than the benefit you got from selling it, which is 80 cents. So better not to have made it, better to contract if you're at a point like that. If you're to the left of that circled point, the benefit of selling another unit would be 80 cents, the same as it is everywhere. The cost of making another unit would be less than 80 cents. Make it, sell it, you'll do better. That's the uniquely correct profit maximizing point for that firm. Total revenue is price times quantity. That's 104 a day from that diagram. Total cost is the average total cost at that quantity times Q. That's 48 cents a bat times 130 bats a day. That's 62.40 a day. Its profit is a number. The number is dollars per day. It's not dollars per bat or bats per minute or anything else. It's dollars per day. You can tell at a glance what it is if you take the graphical approach, which is why I find that approach more intuitively appealing. Whether you do or not, it's up to you. You don't have to think about these things graphically, but you look for the point at which price equals marginal cost. What's total revenue? It's price times quantity, so it's the area of this big rectangle. That's total revenue. What's average cost? It's the average total cost times quantity. That's this rectangle, the smaller one below the pink rectangle. What's the profit of the firm? It's the big rectangle minus the lower small one. It's the pink rectangle. You can just look at it and see whether it has a profit opportunity. If so, how much profit will it make? What's the right quantity? Is shutdown triggered? You know, all those questions you answer at a glance from that diagram. That's why I think the diagram is worth incorporating into your way of thinking about costs, but that's up to you. Question?
What was the bigger triangle? Rectangle again?
The total revenue is the 80 cents per bat times the 130 bats per day. That's this rectangle. This one, that's total cost. That's the average total cost per bat. 48 cents times 130 is the area of that rectangle. Revenue minus cost, that's profit. C-dash.
Are we talking about only explicit costs here or explicit and implicit costs when we talk about?
We're talking about all costs. If it's a cost you incur, whether you make a payment or not to do it, it's in there. So in this case, the way we usually illustrate the examples, you own the capital, and so you're not writing a check for it, but in the long run, you could sell the capital and invest the money. So the fact that you haven't invested the money means that that's the money you don't earn from having done that is the implicit cost of the capital. And that's all in that average total cost figure. In the numbers you see in the Wall Street Journal, that implicit cost isn't part of it. Producer surplus. This is so easy, I'm not going to spend any time on it. I'm going to tell you it's exactly analogous to the consumer surplus concept. It's the difference between the price the seller gets and the reservation price, the minimum price the seller would have been willing to take for the sale of the product. Okay, and it's sometimes in reference to a single producer selling a single item, or it could be the market as a whole. It just depends on the context. And to calculate it, it's exactly analogous to what we did in the case of producer surplus. I can go fast here because this is easy. The cashew market, the very same cashew market we looked at before. There's a supply and demand curve, the very same ones we looked at before. Before, we calculated the producer surplus. It was the area of that triangle. Excuse me, the consumer surplus. It was the area of that triangle. Now we're going to calculate the producer surplus, the seller surplus. And it turns out to be constructed in an analogous way. The seller gets $8 a pound from the sale of each unit. So in the first unit sold, it's going to be a surplus of 8. Marginal cost is 0. That's a full $8 of surplus. Each unit sold thereafter, the cost is higher of making it, so the surplus is smaller. We're going to add up all those sticks, infinite number of them going out to the equilibrium point. And when we do that, we're going to get the area of that triangle bounded above by the price, bounded below by the supply curve. Each one of these little vertical lines is the difference between the price the seller gets and the minimum amount for which the seller would have been willing to sell that last unit of the product. Add those up, you get the area of that triangle, which is 1/2 the base times the height, and then it's a 4th grade problem at that point. What's the height of that triangle? $8 per pound. $8 per pound. What's the base? It's 8,000 pounds per day. What's the area of the triangle? $8 a pound times 8,000 pounds a day times 1/2, and that's $32,000 per day. Look at the units. The units have to cancel out in the correct way, or you don't get a flow measure of producer surplus that makes any sense. It's the value to them of being able to be in that market. If you said you can't sell cashews anymore unless you buy a license, the collective price you'd be able to get from license sales to cashew sellers would be the producer surplus that they get by being in the market. That's the benefit to them of being in it. It's the highest price they'd be willing to pay to continue their participation in that market. Okay, marginal cost is what supply is all about. And this is the hard idea for many people to grasp. I tried to get this in front of you ever since the very first day we started meeting together. Think about the quiz. The problem about the espresso bar is all about whether you understand marginal cost at the deeper level that I'm shooting for. You got 2 hours. One is busy, use the cheap machine up completely, and you got to work your way into the expensive machine. Cheap machine, 20 cents a cup. Expensive machine, 40 cents a cup. One extra guy comes during that hour. What's the cost of serving him? If you say, well, if he comes at 7:01 when we just opened, where are you going to brew his cup from? The cheap machine or the expensive one? Oh, we're going to brew it from the cheap machine. Did it cost 20 cents to serve him? That's what the person who doesn't understand marginal cost would say. But that would be wrong. The marginal cost of serving that person is 40 cents, the cost of operating one more unit of the expensive machine, because the fact that he came when he normally didn't means you use up the capacity of the cheap machine 1 unit quicker, which means you got to start using the expensive machine 1 customer earlier to serve the people who were coming normally during the heavy flow of that hour. And what did that do to your total cost? It raised them by 40 cents. The marginal cost of serving that guy was 40 cents. If he says, oh, I got my coffee from the cheap machine, that's not relevant. That means you don't understand marginal cost if you offer that argument. Same with the guy wondering how much it costs himself to turn on his porch light on the first day of the month. They bill 8 cents an hour, whether they should or not, it's a separate question. They bill 8 cents an hour after you get up to 1,000 kilowatt hours a month. I always consume at least 1,500. If I turn on an extra light on day 1, I'm going to add 8 cents a kilowatt hour to my bill. That's the marginal cost of doing it. It's not 12 cents, it's 8 cents. I'm going to show you one more example along similar lines where I try to deconstruct this even a little bit more transparently. I want you to understand this. So here's another electric generation problem. We've got a nice hydro facility. We've invested in it. We've incurred all the costs. Now we can produce power from it. It's clean and there's no marginal cost. We've got a coal-fired turbine. If we have used up the capacity from the hydro plant, we've got to use this one. The hydro generator can supply only 1,000 kilowatt hours a day. We would supply all the power from it if we could, but maybe we can't. Any additional power we need, we're going to have to produce from the coal-fired plant, and it costs 10 cents a kilowatt hour to produce power from it. Okay? So, we have a load each day of at least 2,000 kilowatt hours. How much does it cost to serve a house that's connected to the hydro plant? How much does it cost to serve that house? So you got a guy, he's your customer, you're the spokesman for the utility company. He's living in this house. He's got his phone out. He's photographed the lines all the way from his house 55 miles north of here and found that there's one circuit that connects him to the power coming off of that hydroelectric plant. He says, here's the evidence. You're serving me from the electric power plant. I did a Freedom of Information Act request, and I've determined that the cost of operating that plant at the margin is 0, and you're charging me 10 cents, I demand my refund. So it's your job to explain to that customer why he's wrong. Why the cost of serving him is not 0, but instead it's 10 cents. It's not an average of the two costs, it's exactly 10 cents. That's your job. So here's the letter I would write if I were writing to that guy. I would say, suppose you didn't exist. Suppose a meteor comes down from the sky. There you are, you're reading the Times. It lands on your house, boom. You no longer exist. How much do we save as a result of that? Well, we don't have to supply you with power anymore if you don't exist. So what are we going to do? We were sending hydropower over that route into your house. Now that line's gone. It blew up. What are we going to do? We're going to take the power that came to here, we're going to cut the line that goes from the coal plant to that house, and we're going to hook it up to the hydro plant, and we're going to send the hydropower to that guy. What's that going to do to our costs? It's going to, if we freed up 1 kilowatt hour, if that's what you use, just for simplicity, then we've got an extra kilowatt hour to send to him that we used to produce with coal. Now we're producing by hydro. We reduced our cost by 10 cents. So when you go away, we save 10 cents per kilowatt hour. You think you should pay less than the cost of serving you? What's your argument? You think we're collecting too much revenue? Well, maybe we are, maybe we're not. It costs a lot of money to build this plant. Maybe charging 10 cents a kilowatt hour generates less than the revenue we need to cover all those costs, in which case we ought to have a hookup fee, something that's not linked to your usage that would enable us to cover our costs. If we're covering our costs and then some, maybe we ought to have a negative hookup fee to distribute the surplus revenues to you. But the marginal charge, the one we ought to charge if we want to encourage efficient use, is exactly 10 cents per kilowatt hour, because that's the cost you impose on the system. If you check out at Wegmans and you have 3 steaks, and the clerk charges you 3 times the amount that she charged the guy in front of you who had only 1 steak, you don't say, that's unfair. You charged me 3 times as much as you charged her. She'd look at you like you didn't understand English if you said that. What do you mean it's not? You got 3 steaks, you got only 1. Of course I charge you 3 times. It's fair to charge for 3 steaks 3 times as much as for 1 because it imposes 3 times the cost on the operation. And that's the exact same principle here. It's just harder to see that it imposes that cost. And if you don't understand marginal cost, then you won't see it. You can't see it. But that won't describe any of you by the time you get out of this course, I hope. You'll all see exactly why 10 cents is the uniquely correct marginal cost estimate. Now, I've taken you too long. I'm going to ask you to consider the last little bit of the points made in the slides, which are that sometimes a shift in demand causes a shift in supply as a result, but and I'll give you some examples of when that might happen, but most of the time I want you to ignore that. So if the demand for bikes goes up, they need more steel to produce bikes, that would increase the demand for steel. That means steel would get more expensive, so that would shift the supply curve for bikes. No, don't go there. And you shouldn't go there because steel is the steel used making bikes is such a small fraction of the total steel market that we can ignore that effect. Sometimes the effects will be big enough not to ignore, but not in that case.